It's a privilege to be with you, and it's wonderful to be back in this cathedral in the center of Tshwane. The last time I was here was in 2017, when this cathedral was home to a service of people who were gathering to campaign against corruption and against state capture. And this cathedral was full of all sorts of people, flags, musicians, activists, and with us were friends who have since passed on. Ahmed Kathrada was here that day. Johnny Clegg, talking about creativity, came and sang from this place where I'm standing here on that day. And that day in 2017 helped to rally a nation to stand up again for justice and decency, and to try to make sure that the resources that are plentiful in all of our countries go to people who need them, rather than to elites and rather than into people's pockets. So it's great to be here, but it's even greater to be with you. Because when I was invited by Stefan to come and be a plenary speaker today, I immediately looked at the program. I didn't know very much about the work of the Institute for Urban Ministry, I have to confess. But when I started to look, I immediately felt excited, because I knew that I would be with my people. And I knew that I would make connections, that I would learn, and that I would leave here with much more than what I brought or came into the room with. And listening to Genevieve just now, I already feel energized and enriched and more determined than I was half an hour ago. I'm also happy to have this opportunity to speak to people who are working on the front line of communities for social justice. Not, as Genevieve said, people who perform justice, which is what many people in our civil society do. I've worked in civil society for 30 years. Civil society, for me, its danger is that it's become an elite project. People in civil society want the same wages as people at the top of government, as people at the top of business. And they keep on doing the same things, and they say that their constituency is poor people, and that their beliefs are based on justice, but they're no longer prepared to take the risks that are needed. They're no longer prepared to subvert. Because once you have a stake in this society, in this rotten, sad, broken, unjust society in which we live in, it doesn't matter what your beliefs are often. If your feet are deeply into that society, then you won't do too much to rock the boat. And I was also happy to be here because I think that this year's consultation is taking place at a very crucial point in the history of our world and in the history of South Africa. I don't think many of us anticipated just how fast our world could degenerate in the last few years, starting with COVID-19 and now continuing with the wars that are growing and are imminent in many parts of the world. COVID-19 and these wars didn't present us with anything new. They exposed the fault lines that already exist in our society. But there's also no doubt that they have accelerated the decay and the crisis that we are facing. So as we stand here today as activists, we face colliding, converging, multiple crises in every community, in every country, in every part of the world that are leaving people feeling displaced and powerless and depressed. I mean, COVID-19 in South Africa, probably in many of your countries, has led to an explosion of mental illness and of anxiety. And again, that is part of this new environment that we are going to have to reorient to. All of us are going to have to reorient to. In South Africa, we're still challenged with gross corruption. 2 nights ago, I stood outside the home of a lady called Babita Deokaran, who was shot dead just after dropping her daughter at school 1 year ago, 23rd of August 2021, just because she was doing her job as a senior finance manager in our Department of Health. That's the norm in South Africa. In Africa, across Africa, we're facing starvation, linked to bad governance, linked to the war in Ukraine. Across the world, I believe we're facing war and dislocation. Last night I was talking to an activist in Germany who was very, very depressed, and I had no understanding before talking to her and being able to look in her eyes just how difficult the situation in Europe is and is becoming more and more difficult as a result of the ramifications of this growing war in Europe and in other parts of the world. So it strikes me that the ages have turned. We've moved from an age of hope, because many of us were hopeful 20 years ago and 30 years ago. We thought that the world was embracing human rights, embracing justice. We've moved from an age of hope into an age of hate, from an age of human rights into an age of human wrongs. And we are going to have to steel ourselves. As Genevieve said, are we ready for this world? You know, if we are everyday change makers, part of everyday change making starts with understanding the environment in which we are living. The environment in which we are living is one where politics and political institutions are failing everywhere. They are incapable of solving the problems that we face. We have to recognize that. And by recognizing that, we have to say, well, if politics and politicians can't solve the problems, then it is only going to be the people who solve the problems. And that's where I want to talk to hope, because I don't want to leave us depressed. Because there's a contrast about this world in which we live, which is that on the one hand, there's despair and growing crisis. On the other hand, I don't think the world has ever seen so much positive activism that is happening on the ground, at the level of community. You know, since I stepped down, I worked for many years in an NGO, the Treatment Action Campaign, Section 27, but then when I started working as a journalist for this Maverick Citizen, which I now edit, it gave me freedom to go to many, many different places and see many different struggles and talk to many different people in many different communities. And that has given me hope, because it's amazing. There is no day where you will not be able to find somebody who is doing something to try and advance justice. And what I see is people searching and revisiting. I see people inventing. I see this creativity that we are talking about. I see a recalibration of values and people beginning to cast off materialism, consumerism, trying to think that life is climbing up the ladder continually. But I think the problem that we face, because the question I keep asking myself, and I don't have an answer to it, is if there is such a preponderance of good in the world, why is it that bad is winning? Why is it that a relatively small number of evil people call the shots in the world, when there are so many fundamentally good people and so many people working for good? And I do think we have to grapple with that question, because if we don't square up to that question, then evil will win. Evil will win in this age if we don't get our act together, if we don't think creatively. Because I think one of the problems is that good doesn't get seen enough. It doesn't join up forces. You know, I work in Johannesburg, and people in one suburb don't know what the people in the next suburb are doing. Everybody's working on food security, but if you go to Bertram's, they've got a wonderful thing called the People's Pantry, and they have a wonderful, what they call circular economy, where people collect recyclable waste, and then they bring their waste in, and they get a token for it, and the token is used to buy food, and the recyclable waste is turned into toys for children, etc. And then on the other side of the hill, there's a suburb called Norwood and Orange Grove. And the people in Norwood and Orange Grove don't know what the people in Bertram's and Lawrenceville are doing. So we keep reinventing the wheel. We develop best practices, but we don't learn from our best practices. And so what happens is that good doesn't become a power. It doesn't become an alternative power. And one of the things I feel I've learned through my activism over many years is that power only responds to power. It doesn't matter if you have good evidence. It doesn't matter if you have good research. It doesn't matter if you have good ideas. The power that controls our governments, that controls our economy, is not interested in that. It only responds to alternative powers that threaten it. And so I ask myself, how are we going to build that power? And what sort of power is it? Because it's not the ugly power. When I talk about power, power is ugly. It's not the ugly power. We don't want to emulate the power that is bad. We want to build a different type of power. We have to join people up. People have been fragmented. People have been atomized, individualized, and so on. I don't have the answer to that. I'm putting the question to you for your deliberations. And that, for me, is why these deliberations and witness and practice are so important. And so I wanted to come here and challenge you. I think Genevieve already did. But that we can't just keeping on. That the time that we are living in demands more of us. And there are 3 specific issues that I wanted to talk about in the remaining 10 minutes, if you'll give me 10 more minutes. The first is the power that I think we all have as individuals, and this is, in a sense, where creativity becomes important. The second is the importance of local community now. And the third is building what I call building a social architecture to survive and get beyond the coming storms. Now, starting with the power that we have as individuals and what we must use it for. We live in a time of growing restrictions on individual freedom. We're very lucky in South Africa. Many of you are less lucky from other African countries than we are, because we still have a constitution that gives me a lot of power, and everybody in this country a lot of power if you use it. You know, I used that power that it gives me when I was one of the founders of the Treatment Action Campaign to build a movement that has prevented 5.5 million people from dying. I can actually say that to you, that our power stopped death on a huge scale. That same power can be mobilized to stop hunger. That same power can be mobilized around healthcare systems. We have it at the moment in this country, but it won't be here forever. As colleagues, I heard there was somebody from Maputo, I heard other parts. Power is scared of individuals. It's scared of our power. That's why what is happening across the world is what we call this shrinking civic space. Because the history of the world is about the history of the power of individuals to change the world for better. There's a beautiful book called Bury the Chains, which is a book about the history of the campaign against slavery that started in 1787. You won't believe it, but that campaign actually started with 7 people in a printing room in an age before there was electricity, never mind internet and airplanes and cars and so on and so on. It literally started when a group of people got together and said, we're going to fight slavery. And you can look across the world. There isn't time to talk about the history of those struggles. But the thing that I would say when I'm talking about power and building power is that people are bored of old forms of power. This is where creativity becomes important. I have many comrades in the trade union movement, for example, but they talk a language that is old. They talk a jargon that doesn't touch people's hearts. They're talking about things that concern everybody, but they can't get people to stand up. You know, when we started TAC, we thought about creativity, so we knew there was a lot of stigma around HIV. And we had people who were killed for disclosing their HIV status. So we created this t-shirt that this is one of many, that just said HIV positive on the front of it. It didn't say anything other than HIV positive, but it made people think. If you didn't have HIV and you wore this t-shirt, then you had to endure people's stigma and stares, and you could see people are looking at you, they're thinking, hey, that person's got HIV. If you had HIV, it helped you feel solidarity with other people with HIV. It was a way to be open about living with HIV. And that type of creativity honestly helped to create a movement. I remember a young woman, her name was Sarah Tlatlele. I went to meet her, it gave power. I went to meet her in Sharpeville. She had HIV. Her child had been born with HIV. In the house where she lived in Sharpeville, the family wouldn't allow her to use the knives and forks and plates. The first time I met Sarah, she was sitting in a corner in the house, eating out of a pan and crying. She couldn't stop crying. And then over 3 years, through work in the Treatment Action Campaign, I saw Sarah get her dignity back. I saw Sarah find her power. And eventually one day I saw her standing outside the Pretoria High Court here, speaking to the media with her baby, Khotso, in her arms as a woman living with HIV. I'm living with HIV. I'm standing up for my rights. And so we need creativity to unleash that power is in everyone. It's not about our power. That's what I've learned as an activist. Activism isn't about, let's find some people who are going to ride in and save the world. Activism is about how do we transfer our power to other people. And a lot of that is about creativity. It's about imagination. I've realized that activism without imagination achieves nothing. Imagination, the ability to dream, and then the ability to move from a dream to actually making that thing happen. So again, I think we have to think a lot about language when we talk about creativity. This language, there's a language that moves people, and there's a language that demobilizes people. I am somebody who loves poetry. I went a few days ago to listen to Barbara Masekela, many of you will know the person, speaking about joy, justice, and politics or something. And when I walked out of that room, I thought, okay, we're ready again. So creative is so important. But the last thing I want to say about the power of us is that it's not just about the political power that we build. It's this power to subvert norms, the power to set a different example, the power to affirm other people, the power to go against the stream. It's as simple as this. I make a point of smiling and greeting people. When I run in the park, I talk to people and I smile and I greet people. And people feel seen. It's the most powerful thing, that smile that comes back in most instances. But it's people who feel seen who are not seen for the most part. And this society is pushing us apart. We have to act in a way that pulls us back together again. Which brings me to the second point, which is the importance of the local. And this was said beautifully by Genevieve. The just suburb, the just city. Many of us grew up, I'm speaking for myself at least, in a time where we believed that the power of national government was what was needed to provide services and regulate society and fix society. You would have heard that once upon a time, as a youngster, I was a Marxist, and Marxists believe that if we can just control the state, and then the state will fix everything, and so on and so on. There's a great deal to the critique that Marxism offers of society. Unfortunately, many Marxists have become the opposite of what they claim to stand for. But I think this idea that things are going to be fixed from above is not going to happen. And so we have to revise our assumptions. I also am somebody who for years has, we demand, government must do this, government do this, we demand. I've decided I'm going to stop demanding. I'm going to do. I'm going to help people to do and to make it. Because the truth of the matter is that the state is retreating as a provider of many basic services on this claim that they don't have enough money. They have plenty of money. But the bottom line, you know better than me. Look at the state of education in poor communities. Look at the state of healthcare services. Look at safety and security. Where's the state? It's not there any longer. It's not putting the money there any longer. Now, if that's the case, then we are going to have to take over, frankly. And when we take over, we're going to have to rebuild back upwards, because we do need a state, a competent and a capable state. But we're going to have to rebuild it. And it starts at the level of the community. I had this epiphany. It came to me because, I work with homeless people in my park, Albert's Farm, in Western Johannesburg. And I upset the home-full people in the community by taking the side of the homeless people and going to court and getting those people reinstated after their shelters were demolished. But one of the things I realized then is I could have walked away. I'm busy, I'm an activist, so-called, I'm an activist, so if I'm an activist, I don't need to worry about that. Go to my office instead. But then I realized, no, if you can't build social contracts at the community level between people who think that they are antagonistic to each other and shouldn't be, then you're never going to build social contracts at a national level. So I wanted to try, how can I get these white people who haven't yet shaken their racism and the way they view poor people and the way they view black people, how can I get them to change? How can I get them to see the people in the park as allies and friends, and that they have a common interest in preserving and sharing in that park? It's not an easy struggle. A year later, I'm not sure if we've made how much progress we've made. We've managed to set up a drop-in center, which is good. I have many friends in the park, which is good. But I'm not sure if we've overcome those social antagonisms. But it's a work in progress. But the point I wanted to make here is that the local is going to become more and more important as the climate crisis in particular grips us. It's going to become more and more important for food security. It's going to become more important for education. It's going to become more and more important for the environment. And so this idea of the just city, the just suburb, is really an idea whose time is now. And we have to give a lot of thought to it. And that again was why I was excited to come and share with you, because the sense is that many of you have done this and have great examples and models that's putting my journalist hat on, and I'm here with a colleague from the Daily Maverick. I want to write about, I want to find ways to tell those stories to people who need to emulate them. And the last thing I wanted to talk, and then I'll stop, is to say that we have to be thinking about building, we have to act local, but we do have to think global. We do have to be thinking about building a social architecture to survive and to get beyond the coming storms, literally the coming storms of the climate crisis and the social breakdown that the climate crisis is bringing with it. We need to work out what we need to keep and what we need to lose at this time. I think there are many things that were important that were built between the last great global conflagration, if you like, the Second World War, although there's been many conflagrations, and it's a very Eurocentric view that thinks that was the last great global crisis. But for once bear with me for a minute. Out of the Second World War, we got the idea of universal human rights. We got the idea of multilateral institutions like the United Nations and so on and so on, much of which is breaking down. But in that period of the second half of the 20th century, what do we want to keep? Well, I think we want to keep human rights-based constitutions. I think we want to keep the whole architecture of human rights, which is actually a very developed architecture globally. If you look at behind the ineffectiveness of things like the United Nations, it's incredible what's there, what is being produced. It's just that states are not really interested in doing anything with the stuff that's being produced. We want to keep truth, because truth is, and the notion of truth and the ability of people to recognize truth. Those are some of the things that we want to keep. We need to lose materialism. We need to lose greed. We need to lose accumulation. We need to lose capitalism in the shape into which it has developed. It is an evil and dangerous force to the world. There's no doubt. I go back to my Marxist learnings for that. But there's no doubt, if you look at the fact that it can't, faced with the climate crisis, it's powerless. Its logic of accumulation means it can't behave differently. I've read the most frightening book recently called The Uninhabitable Earth. I wouldn't recommend you read it because it is frightening. It's based on science, and it shows us what is going to happen in our world in the decades that are coming. And I feel sorry for my children and your children and the children of their children. People are talking about the 22nd century as the century of hell. And I don't think it will take another 78 years, I'm getting my maths wrong, anyway, to the next century before that century of hell arrives, if you look at the climate disasters that are looming. So in conclusion, this is a time of opportunity. It is a time of hope. It is a time of activism. It is a time of possibility. There's no doubt about it. So what are the key words? Well, I think the key words are activism, cooperation, compassion, hope, subversion, imagination, creativity, well-being. You can do an exercise and put those key words together. But we have to be sources of hope. Not sources of hope because we preach hope when everybody's actually feeling very despairing. We have to be sources of hope by proving what's possible to people, by showing that another world is possible, and that you start by building that another world at the local area. One of the things a poet said at this meeting I was at the other day, and I never thought about it like that: beauty is a basic need. Beauty is a basic need. What is beauty, and what can we do to put beauty into people's lives, even if they live the most deprived of existences? So I'm going to finish reading something by a book that I found, I didn't expect it to have a powerful impact on me, because I thought if you have something called the Book of Joy, then it's going to be airy-fairy and abstract and so on, a set of conversations between the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. But it's actually a fantastic book, this Book of Joy. It's a conversations over a week between the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Tutu about a range of things. But the interesting thing is that all the kind of discussion about emotions and compassion and justice, etc., there's a parallel narrative throughout the book that shows how science actually supports the fact that cooperation is something that is built into human DNA rather than the opposite. That actually smiling triggers certain responses. Now I understood why do I smile and why I get such joy when somebody smiles back at me. And then suddenly, oh, there's a science involved here. But let me finish with this. This is something that Archbishop Tutu talked about in a discussion that they were having about hope versus optimism. He says, I say to people that I'm not an optimist because that, in a sense, is something that depends on feelings more than the actual reality. We feel optimistic or we feel pessimistic. Now, hope is different in that it is based not on the ephemerality of feelings, but on the firm ground of conviction. I believe with a steadfast faith that there can never be a situation that is utterly, totally hopeless. Hope is deeper and very, very close to unshakable. It's in the pit of your tummy. It's not in your head, it's all here, he said, pointing to his abdomen. Despair can come from deep grief, but it can also be a defense against the risks of bitter disappointment and shattering heartbreak. Resignation and cynicism are easier, more self-soothing postures that do not require the raw vulnerability and tragic risk of hope. To choose hope is to step firmly forward into the howling wind, bearing one's chest to the elements, knowing that in time this storm too will pass. And that's kind of how I feel looking at the world as we look at the world now. So thank you very much for this opportunity to engage with you, and thank you for the work you do. Thank you.